آزادی بیان.
言论自由
Free speech.
It's a great pleasure to chair the session on abstractly entitled Art and Literature and to introduce our two speakers. First will be Dr. Shruti Kapila, who teaches history at the University of Cambridge and who has already become very well known as the foremost figure in reviving, or rather introducing, intellectual history. Our second speaker will be Patrick French, who I'm sure is known to most of you, biographer, writer, with a remarkable range, dealing with figures as dispersed in time and place as Young Husband on the one hand and a brilliant biography of Naipaul on the other.
I wasn't going to sort of disobey Faisal when he suggested I should take one particular case, and the case that I have elected to speak on is Maqbool Fida Hussein's Walk Out of the Nation. So this is India's most famous artist, MF Hussain. This is him sitting in his Kensington apartment with his last major mural, major piece of work, which is on Benares. I'm going to read out and I'm going to show some images as we go along, which by the way have all been pretty much been sourced by his persecutors from the websites from the Hindutva plot itself. This has to say something about freedom of expression and how actually constraining it is actually disseminating it. Okay, I'm going to read out. So it would be presumptuous to open a discussion on freedom of expression in India by stating that there are two versions of it. After all, we are in St. Anthony's College, and it is here that Isaiah Berlin propounded the highly influential two ideas of liberty that has now become the common sense of liberalism in our times. Chris Bailey has recently amplified Berlin's concept of liberty and attested to the vibrant prehistory of these concepts as they became paradigmatic of 19th century India, and that laid down the intellectual foundations of India's political modernity. Bailey goes on to say that moderation, and indeed a very positive and intervening form of liberty, presaged and formed the lineage of India's democracy. It is now commonplace to state that India's experience of freedom in the 20th century took place first under the name of nationalism, which was then institutionalized under democracy. As that oft-repeated cliche and a sneering joke that is a staple for commentators in Indian politics goes, what Indians had historically prepared and fought for was independence, but what they got was, however, democracy. Yet, like all jokes, an uncanny truth nevertheless comes to the surface. In the transition from national freedom to an independent and republican democracy, the triad of modern politics, namely liberty, equality, and fraternity, got rearranged and repositioned. Without historical precedent, let alone preparedness, India's institutional architecture, as expressed, empowered, and enacted by the Constitution, situated social justice or equality as a central political experience for the new country. In the wake of large-scale violence that demarcated and declared the two nation-states, what also took place was a conversion of a fraternal relationship between Hindus and Muslims to that of neighbors. Antagonism of caste was converted into competition via authoritative action, while a brotherhood of religions was recast along a national neighborhood, creating both the first Muslim state and simultaneously the world's largest minority, namely the Indian Muslims. This is to say, and as I've discussed this elsewhere, that equality and fraternity became the principles of Indian democracy, producing a form of political absolutism that consigned liberty or freedom as a condition at best and a distant prospect at worst for this bold and future-oriented politics. Freedom or liberty in India's democratic age thus appears, alas, I'm going to say it, apologies to Sir Isaiah and Sir Chris, in two forms. It appears either as an assumed and unconscious condition that is more often than not also assumed to be infinite. Or on the other hand, it appears as injury and offense. Between the demand for its infinite play and the experience and objection of injury, freedom and its expression as a question has appeared with unfailing regularity for at least 2 decades now. With full awareness of the metaphorical burden that injury carries, this very corporeal notion of injury provides a critical bodily contour and container to the almost ethereal, air-like quality of freedom that is necessary but only known when put into jeopardy. It is after all the embodiment or representation of the idea of India itself that became the reason for and that led MF Hussain in 2006, after several decades of walking across its expanse, to ultimately walk out of the nation itself. In its contextual setting, the conditions that surrounded the combative politics against Hussain and Rushdie are not entirely dissimilar, even though their subjective positions as artists could not be more different. Emblematic of modernism, and for the first 50 years of independence, Hussain and India were inseparable iconic entities, each producing the other. If India was a nation that was celebrated as it confounded critics with its robust endurance, then Hussain was a nation's celebrity artist. So here you have so this is him walking always as he got to be known, barefoot across the nation. He would walk all over the country, and that is sort of almost his signature. This is him on the Mahabharata, sort of epic renditions, all major, whether they were Hindu, Muslim, Christian epics and stories were. And this is, of course, the horses, partly from the Karbala series. And this is to sort of add to some connectivity with the previous speaker. This is a modern woman having a potshot at Brahmanical tyranny. And this is Durga. I approach Hussain and his works and the confrontation surrounding it here as a historian of contemporary political ideas. For close to a decade, and since at least 1996, Hussain's art has become a site of confrontation. In October 1996, the Minister of Cultural Affairs of India's then richest state, Maharashtra, a representative of the locally strong Shiv Sena body member, Pramod Navalkar, slapped cases against Hussain under sections 153A and 295A of the Indian Penal Code on the dual and related charges of obscenity and for provoking religious sentiments. A few days before Hussain was thrown into this legal whirlpool that would continue to churn until his death, his works were vandalized in the privately owned Hussain Doshi Gallery in Ahmedabad in the neighbouring state of Gujarat, now infamous for the largest Muslim pogrom and the richest state in independent India today. 2 years later, in May 1998, Hussein's house in Bombay was broken into. These violently theatrical episodes were conducted and openly claimed by various bodies of the Hydra-headed Sangh Parivar, or the undivided family that owes its allegiance to the politics and ideas of Hindutva. By 2006, these confrontations were no longer confined to the Hindutva heartlands of shining Western India. Asia House in London in 2006 had to close down a major exhibition of Hussein's work, by which time this confrontation had reached its crescendo. This was because by 2006, the controversy was fixated on the figure of Mother India itself. In the preceding decade, it was Hussein's depiction of the pantheon of Hindu female deities, beginning with Saraswati, or knowledge, and latterly of Draupadi, the female heroine whose undressing had instigated the epic war of Mahabharata, that was systematically defaced. Betraying a lack of irony, it was almost always female Hindu deities that were targeted for a concerted defacement. These acts were part of the repertoire of a new set of politics that would redistribute the work of religion in the dying decades of 20th century India. These confrontational actions, however, exceeded their content from being straitjacketed along party political lines. Hussain had, for instance, depicted the fierce goddess Durga with its latent content evoking Mrs. Gandhi during the height of the Indian emergency that he supported. By 2006 and the blackening of a Durga painting in Asia House, such contextual contents, however, had been evacuated. Instead, a singularity of obscenity came to demarcate the question of freedom and the Hussain controversy. Now, what is this question about the nation's obscenity? With theatrical excess, paintings, reproductions and exhibitions of Hussain were attacked and defaced across the country for the best part of a decade. Images, as W.J.T. Mitchell says, are pseudo-persons, and in the case of Mother India, this pseudo-person has been the spectre of the subcontinent for more than a century. Initially, the attack on Saraswati points to injury as one belonging to the realm of religion and the sacred. Here, the common ritual of robing and disrobing of deities in fact betrayed Hussein's intimacy with Hinduism. In other words, in depicting various gods and goddesses from epics and vernacular traditions alike, Hussein's endeavours were born out of the familiarity of the insider as opposed to the eye of the outsider, in which Hindu gods and goddesses appeared at once monstrous and maligned. With Mother India, Hussain had entered a century-long conversation that had started in a seditious vein. Mother India, or the divinity, I don't have that. Here it is. This is it. Mother India, the divinity of the nation, had inserted itself through the logic of colonial law itself. And this was raised earlier in a question raised by by Rana Mitra. In his powerful work on censorship and sedition, Chris Finney has argued that sedition created the very object it had sought to suppress and control, namely the political. Precisely because colonial censorship and proscription viewed religion as apolitical, and authorized religion increasingly became the vehicle for a fugitive politics. This was, above all, most publicly innovated by Gandhi's predecessor, the nationalist Bal Gangadhar Tilak. So while the censor and the magistrate were eagle-eyed in suppressing political discourse, the realm of religion proved to be potent to articulate all that could not be said under what was officially deemed political. The triangulation thus of religion, censorship or sedition law and the political in Finney's words produced a deadly cosmological politics, and in my view was constitutive of a political theology. By political theology, what is meant here is not simply the public life of religion, but the religious or theological precepts that script and enchant all modern politics, secular or otherwise. Moreover, nationalist politics of the kind that Tilak inaugurated and Gandhi monopolized understood the political as beyond, if not opposed to the state. The post-colonial, though, has produced a reversal or the triangulation of law or the state, religion and the political, a transformation that seems to have gone unnoticed in the current framing of the discussion. As the well-received observation by Mitchell goes, images have little to do with content but convey everything about context. What is it about our age that has replaced iconoclasm with that of iconoclash? What had then transpired between 1970, when Hussain had painted Saraswati, and 1996, when the same painting incited offence, injury, and the battery of legalese to immobilize and in the end exile Hussain out of India itself? First, and not to write out of the content from the discussion entirely, it is clear to any casual observer the nude, with all its open relationality with the divine and the erotic, is constitutive of the canon of Indian aesthetics. It is as obvious that such representations have been part of the subcontinental horizon as it is equally ineffectual to restrict Hussain and the epic tradition now to the long and classical artistic conversation alone. This was, after all, the defense that people made on Hussain's behalf, that he was just continuing an older tradition, something that the Panikkar position, if I can put it. Far from being defined in the modern era, images are one of the last bastions of magical thinking, and therefore one of the most difficult things to regulate with laws and rationally constructed policies so difficult. In fact, that the law seems to become infected by magical thinking as well, and behaves more like an irrational set of taboos than a set of well-reasoned regulations. In Hussein's case, it took a decade, and in 2006, when the absurdity of law came to full focus, and without any effect when it was finally judged in Hussein's favor, declaring that the representations of Saraswati were in fact artistic rather than religious. The Supreme Court judgment in turn aimed to detach any magical quality or even libidinal investment that had fueled the controversy in the first place. Consider here, for instance, that a High Court could declare, in the context of the Babri Masjid dispute, law drama as a legal valid category, which only attested to the political existence of the Hindu god. So you have the complete reversal of the colonial thing about the religious and the political. By the same token, it appeals to the state that are repeatedly sought. This is what we saw with Rushdie in Jaipur. So these are people protesting, asking for the state to securitize their freedom. By the same token, it is appeals to the state that are repeatedly sought to seek its protection rather than to subvert and circumvent the norms of the state. It would be missing the point if this transformation from the colonial to the national is viewed as a transformation from a repressive state to a free state alone. What has been critical, though, has been the suborning of freedom in terms of fraternity. Secondly, the confrontation highlighted the end of the compact between a national elite and its ability to exclusively exhaust the politics of representation. A new political horizon, dubbed as India's second democratic upsurge, has dismantled the Nehruvian-nurtured vanguard to exclusively speak for the nation. This inability is especially true of Hussein's defenders rather than of Hussain himself. Contextually, though, it is indeed the question of the national, rather than freedom itself, that has emerged as the point of anxiety, with considerable libidinal investment that can be gleaned from the rhetoric of injury, hurt, and offence. Here, I would like to clarify and critique the dominant understanding that Hindutva, in whose name Hussain and his works Here I would like to clarify and critique the dominant understanding that Hindutva, in whose name Hussain and his works were targeted, is a variant of nationalism. In most discussion, Hindutva is either understood as a form of nationalism as gleaned from the now ubiquitous term Hindu nationalism. Alternatively, in a number of studies, Hindutva is uncovered as a true nature of Indian nationalism. In such interpretations, secularism is indeed a pseudo or a thin veil covering religious passions that lie on the skin of the nation. Scratch the surface of India and what you see behind it is really Hindu India. That is what I wish to critique. As a philosophy of violence, Hindutva, though is through its key influential ideologue, Vinayak Savarkar, deemed India into a temporal plot of violence. Unlike Nehru's recourse to history that attested to India's individuality as marked by its diversity, for Savarkar, history and arguably even Hinduism was not on the side of Hindutva. Originating from a point of lack, Hindutva or political Hinduism had neither antecedents nor history. As I've argued elsewhere, Hindutva was a name to bridge the empty gap or the void between the political and Hinduism. The obsessive recourse to history writing by its ideologues, and especially Savarkar, was in the end an aim to fill out this empty gap or the lack of history itself. Though the dominant form of recounting of history under the designation of Hindutva was organized under the category of loss, consider Muslim invasions, the very plenitude of that recounted loss pointed to its opposite, i.e. an absence. Hindutva is a political ideology that claimed and spoke for the future instead. In the case of Tilak and colonial fugitive politics, religious metaphors were deployed to convey political messages. For Hindutva, though, religion and its metaphors held little sway. Savarkar, remember, was an atheist. Completed in 1963, 6 glorious epochs, which I've compared at length with the discovery of India, was not merely a hieroglyphic account of post-independence India, but served as a chronicle of a future foretold. Both in its spatial and temporal predicates, India and Savarkar's account is only nominally defined, but its history is filled out as a sequential account of violence. India in this account was converted into a temporal plot of warfare and emerged as a permanent battlefield. War that formed the understanding of the political was not merely an ideological vector for Hindutva. War as a decision-making event marked out enemies, but equally importantly, war was seen as a central element that framed the history and geography of the subcontinent. So you need internal externalities. Hindutva as a neologism gained significance in this context, in that by naming itself it created an object as much as it became a rigid designator, creating connections, equivalences, but also displacement within its constitutive elements. Hindutva emerged as a rigid designator, which is to say, as a totalizing force field that disallowed the sliding away of any of these elements into another set of meaning. It is precisely why Mother India or Saraswati or Durga or ad infinitum is singularized as obscene. It doesn't matter what they are. Hussein's intimacy with Hinduism and Islam's intimate history with India is what evokes that rivalry of Hindutva, which is distant and disconnected, and can only emerge through such confrontations. As a figurative artist, Hussain, it would seem, chose to deface his own works. So this painting initially had no etchings on it, you can't really see, but the left breast would say Gujarat, the right is Bhopal, and all, as it were, all the crimes of post-colonial India are etched out. He defaces his own painting after the attacks. Hussain, it would seem, chose to deface his own works. The original Mother India, disrobed across the subcontinental horizon, was retouched and renamed. Hussain chose to designate each historical wound on this body itself, naming and etching Bhopal, the site of the largest industrial disaster, and Gujarat, the state of the Muslim pogrom, as frontal depictions to the backdrop of India's geography. The course of the controversy had also contorted Hussein's original rendition of Mother India. The matter of offence attenuated by violence is matched by Hussein's iconoclasm, with the painting itself re-emerging as desecrated. I want to conclude with the democratic gesture of walking, since Hussain did walk out of the nation. More than the Supreme Court, it was in fact Hussain himself who demonstrated his ability to hear the tonality of this new form of politics, which the Supreme Court, I feel, has not been able to hear. The official consideration of democracy here would lead us to detect the obvious play of elections and their imperatives. The initial Hussain controversy, much like Jaipur Literary Festival and Salman Rushdie, last year took place in the electoral context of Uttar Pradesh, came to the surface in the context of Hindutva's electoral aspirations in Madhya Pradesh. From the heart of the country's territory and cast as the overt grammar of politics, the question of the brother in India's democratic fraternity remains preeminent. The historical sequences that opened at the beginning of the 20th century may have changed their order and primacy, caste over religion, for instance. They nevertheless repeat as they redistribute some of the foundational and iconic political practices of modern India. This is not so much to repeat history as a farce or even renew a dying legacy, but rather to seek contiguity with another history. This is Anna Hazare's image with fasting. We are all saturated with the act of public fasting that reappeared in the likeness of Gandhi with Anna Hazare. Hussain, though throughout his career, starting in 1948 with the progressive artist groups, and one of the few collective who stayed and practiced as art in India, had acquired another signature. Walking barefoot, the artist's persona was cast through the nation, with his sightings becoming the stuff of excitable memory. We should read Shuddha Brata of Drux Media Collective's obituary, where he says that sort of seeing Hussain walking in the distance in New Delhi is what inspired him at the age of 9 years old to become an artist. Walking barefoot and across the nation was Hussain's iconic act as he chronicled India in its first 50 decades. Walking, as we know, was what constituted Gandhi's political action, marked by its simplicity and equal availability. All it required was a moral courage to stand up and walk. This was, after all, the potency of the plain in the face of a complex and powerful structure of the empire, the stuff of Satyagraha. If injury, as I began, gives body to freedom, then Hussein's walk out of the nation after 90 years in it marks out the limits of national freedom. Or rather, more to the point, it interrupts the representation of the national with freedom as its singular cause. The future of expression in India, be it words, acts, or images, will be guaranteed not by freedom, but by its fearless quality. Thank you.
I like the photograph of Tilak. I thought he looked very scary then. Do you know there was recently an audio recording of him that was discovered? It's kind of amazing to think that we can actually hear his words, and he was berating the audience and telling them to sit down so that I think a religious reading or some performance could begin. Also a word about Bapsi Banu Pavri, the Marchioness of Winchester, in whose name we are speaking today. I've always found her an endlessly fascinating figure, and I noticed a few months ago on the cover of Tatler magazine, I should stress I didn't buy it, I just saw it. And it was advertising the fact that the first non-white Marchioness had just been created, or was about to be created. This is the owner of Longleat, the Marquis of Bath, and his new wife. And anyway, it made me think of the Marchioness of Winchester, although I think she was not with the Marquis for very long, but still, she has the name. So what I thought I'd do is I would speak about quite a variety of things in relation to India's politics of free expression and how they tie with art and literature. And to an extent, what I'm going to say is really anecdotal, based on observation, because I think I've been lucky in that I've met people from quite different positions in relation to the power of the media. I've often worked with state-level journalists, and in particular political journalists, who have an extremely difficult time going about their job for all sorts of reasons that are not strictly about free expression. They're really about localized political power and, to an extent, about localized media ownership. And then I've also come across people at the opposite end, the anchors and the media owners and so on. And so this is my impression. And just briefly to start with M.F. Hussain, I think there are some interesting things to say about his case, which sometimes get forgotten by focusing on the principle of free expression and what he has come to represent. He was charged with creating enmity between different religious communities. He was charged with obscenity, among other things. And by the time that he was coming towards the end of his life and was living in some style in Dubai with his famous red Ferrari, he was in fact able to return to India, but he chose not to because, as he put it, the time was not yet right. And he made the interesting statement that maybe when the BJP returned to power, if they returned to power, that might be a better guarantee of his freedom to return and not be hassled, because he thought that maybe the BJP would want to appear secular and therefore would provide him with a degree of protection. But of course he passed away before that ever actually happened. And I think also another sort of biographical footnote, which is very important with any creative artist. And that was the fact that he found that his absence from India was generating new work. In other words, he was able to continue productively, prolifically with his work despite being away from, if you like, the source of his inspiration. I think it's also important to say that Bharat Mata, which caused such a furore, was not so named by him. It was a well-known auction house who was holding an auction at a five-star hotel. The name was given to a painting that he had never seen or depicted or promoted in that way. And so I think that what you see in his case is a specifically political agenda against him, using him as a symbol, as a prominent Indian Muslim. It's not strictly about freedom of expression, in that in his work he was not, most of the time, really pushing the boundaries. Christopher Bailey made the interesting points about Aubrey Menon and his sort of biographical background, the fact that he was a provocateur to some extent. I don't think that Hussain was. I think most of his work, you know, in the grand scheme of 20th century art, would not be seen as necessarily pushing the artistic boundaries. It was more the fact that he was an easy target for a specifically political campaign by sort of making him into something that was maybe a little bit different from what he sought to be. And I think it's also very interesting, Shruti's point about the fact that he was banned, effectively banned in the UK from the exhibition at Asia House. Now, what happened there was that there was a threat by an organisation which I think I've never heard of again, calling it something like the UK Gurkhas for Hindu Freedom, or something of the word Gurkha came into the job description, if you like, of what they were about. And I don't know if anybody knows who they are or exactly sort of where politically they were coming from. But as so often, it was the threat of action rather than the fairly minor action itself that was the problem. It was people thinking, do we really want to get engaged in this kind of problem? So, to move now to the idea of free speech in India, I think it's very important to work from the starting point that free speech is assumed in India. Anybody who has travelled in different countries will know that there's almost a collective instinct that people have about what they can say on any particular subject. I remember being very struck about 5 years ago in Egypt, speaking to people or trying to speak to people about the government. I wasn't even reporting anything, I was just having a conversation, if you like. And there was a great nervousness about anyone saying what they thought about the state, about the government, about those in authority. It wasn't part of what they did. It was something that perhaps people would do in the right context, but it certainly wasn't part of the everyday conversation. You know, let alone the experience of trying to write a book in Tibet, somewhere where you know that every conversation could be putting somebody at risk. Their liberty, even potentially their life, could be being put at risk by the fact that you are having a conversation with them about what they think of the state they live in. Whereas in India there is a basic assumption of free speech, and a lot of the generation of anger on the subject comes from the fact that people do have that expectation, which to some extent I think does go back to the colonial era. I hope that when Zaria Masani speaks later that he'll maybe say a little bit more about Macaulay and about the fact that he, you know, specifically helped to encourage a press act which would encourage freedom of the press. The great worry at that time, of course, was that British or European merchants would write rude things about the government. This was slightly before the worry about what Indian nationalists might potentially say. So, on the one hand, you have Macaulay linked with the penal code and the idea of suppression, but then again, you also have this pushing forward of free speech. So, I think there is great ambiguity, really running back over several hundred years in Indian ideas about free speech. I remember when I was researching the period around the First World War and directly afterwards, again and again in official documentation you would see very detailed discussions about the application of the Sea Customs Act, whether or not a certain book which told you how to make a homemade bomb should be imported or not, Would it be illegal to stop the importation of the same book through Portuguese territory, with it then crossing over into British Indian territory? So I'm not trying to make the case that there's always been complete freedom of expression, but rather that it is always an idea, it's always a subject of debate and legal argument, going back quite a long way. And I think that maybe the problem in India, as I've come across it, is really more insidious than simply being about the suppression of free speech or about censorship. I think it is noticeable that when discussions on this subject are had, that it's very often the same examples that come up. It can be the instance of the Satanic Verses and what happened there, the Shivaji book, the case of Rohinton Mystery, obviously the more serious suppression during the emergency when the press was directly constrained. I even had this myself when I published Liberty or Debt, and some Congress politicians wanted the book to be suppressed and banned, which luckily never actually happened. But what tends to happen in my experience is that you have a particular publication coming out, either inside India or from abroad, and you have an elite response to it by a comparatively small number of people, which is either for or against. Normally what will happen is that some politician somewhere will say it ought to be banned, and then other people will say whether it should be or shouldn't be. Again, with the case of Great Soul, the Lelyveld book about Gandhi, which Narendra Modi ostentatiously banned, it was still available in bookshops in Gujarat after the ban. And so you have this odd situation, which is familiar to anybody with experience of India, but probably to outsiders would seem a little strange, where books are banned in India, and yet you can still buy them in a bookshop, providing it's quite a distinguished bookshop. I'm talking really here about the ones you get in the lobbies of 4- and 5-star hotels. Somebody with a small and less distinguished bookshop would probably not risk putting in books that will get them in trouble, or potentially get them in trouble. And I think that the kind of language in which this subject is spoken about, for example, it's not unusual to hear activists or writers talk about the fact that they run the risk of being dragged off to prison for doing X or Y. And yet it seems to be really quite rare, meaning almost never, that you actually see the writers and activists being dragged off to prison. And I suppose what that makes me think is that this is fundamentally a class issue. So providing you're relatively privileged in India, you're going to get away with saying pretty much whatever you want, whereas if you're less privileged, you're not going to have that same opportunity. India is certainly the only country I know of where a writer making a statement in a public forum will make front-page news. In most countries there is not so much interest in writers and artists and what they have to say, but in India it's seen as a debate, it's seen as something that is potentially a lead news story. So censorship automatically has an alarming effect on anybody hearing that word. I remember about 2 years ago publishing an article about the relationship between Indian Tamils, Sri Lankan Tamils and the Sri Lankan government on a website called the India Site, which I edit with several other people. And we were then put under a direct denial of service attack. In other words, people are firing demands at the website to the point where it crashes and can't go up. And almost certainly this was being done by people in Sri Lanka who didn't like what was being written in that article. There's no way of knowing, because the thing was routed through America and China, there's no way of knowing whether it was in any way official, some kind of state agency, whether it was simply a private operation. But what was interesting there was that an attack on freedom of speech in that sense immediately created an incredible response from all sorts of other people who directly contacted me and said, you know, can we repost, cross-post, mirror the article? And so the article itself, in fact, was read a great deal more widely because of that. So I think in India there is that idea that freedom of speech has always to be defended, and that people will tend to move quite quickly to seek to do that. And I think it's also critical to say that when the crackdown on individuals happens, or on particular books happens, it's not really the state, most of the time, that is behind it. Instead, it is small, usually small, political movements or even sections of political parties who want to produce a particular effect. Often those political groupings are coming from particular sections of upper castes, often they're coming from the political right. And what tends to happen is that the people who are targeted are not really able to do very much about it except to go through the courts, which inevitably means that it's going to drag out for a very long time. And so what that really is a kind of political harassment by individuals using the mechanisms of the court, rather than it being the government itself. And really when the government does tend to go after people over issues of, or rather when the government does tend to suppress free speech, it's normally done in a thoroughly ham-fisted and half-hearted way. I think what's striking is the way that the Indian state is perfectly capable of going after people when it wants to for particular things. Certainly if you're in an outlying part of the northeast, or if you're in Kashmir and you do something against the forces of the state, you will have a hammer blow beating down upon you. And in the same way, there are certain businesses which have had tax raids, politically motivated tax raids or CPI raids against them in order to produce a particular effect. But that when censorship is done, it seems to be done in this really cockeyed way, which doesn't really produce the effect. It very often produces the reverse effect, if you like. So, just to close, I want to try and identify what I see as being the real and more serious problems connected to free speech. And I'm talking really here in a sort of practical day-to-day sense. One of the problems, and I think this is getting worse, not better, is trial by media. As an example, I would say that the case of Rajesh and Nupur Talwar, which I've had a personal investment in, if you like, they've been falsely accused of the murder of their daughter. They've been hounded and harassed for about 4 years now, and they have an ongoing trial. What you see there is a willingness to report things about that case, and indeed about similar cases which, for whatever reason, are prominent in the news. You see a willingness to report them in a way that bears almost no relation to the facts or the actuality of the trial. I have read, even in the last week, articles about them which contain complete misrepresentations of what actually happened. Now this kind of extremely shoddy journalism is partly about chasing ratings or eyeballs, or about, in the case of certain news channels, managing to be noisier and more aggressive and louder and more demanding than any of the others. But it's also about the fact that there is really no redressal at all for people who are done over by the press in that way. In the case of the Talwars, they've simply given up trying to correct those errors. And that is something that I think is definitely getting worse if you look back to the state of newspapers in particular, even a decade or two ago. If I make an outrageous allegation against someone in this room, Dr. Devji, if I say that he is a criminal and a murderer, the way that would be reported in newspapers in most countries would be author makes outrageous and unfounded allegation against distinguished academic. The way that would be reported in India would be Dr. Devji is a criminal and a murderer, says Patrick French. And you see this again and again and again, and it's constantly happening, and there is no redressal for the people who are abused, if you like, in that way. The other problem, I think, is self-censorship. Now, of course, this is something that happens in any media environment anywhere in the world. People always discuss it, particularly in the United States and to an extent here, in the wake of Leveson. But in India, you definitely do see that. You see that certain families, you see that certain sections of political parties, certain business groups are simply not faced down by the media with the same degree of thoroughness as everyone else. It's not directly censorship. You could still say things somewhere or other, on a website, in a newspaper, but it would have absolutely no traction in the mainstream media. So, you know, that in a way comes back to my earlier point about this seeming to be a sort of elite conspiracy, a phrase that I would be reluctant to use in most contexts. But I think in India, over the issue of freedom of speech often is the case. In other words, your ability to say certain things and get away with it, or to do certain things and get away with it, is largely dependent on your social position. And the third problem, which I would see as really being the summation of everything that I've said earlier, comes down to the relationship between the Indian state and the people. And the fact that increasingly that appears to be out of date. You have all sorts of social and political movements happening all over the world, which are about the question of how the state interacts with the citizen. And I think that in India it's really a situation where the state has certain powers, some of them a legacy of the colonial period, some of them coming from extensive rule by one political party. But the state is able to get away with doing things to the citizen which should not be possible. One of the things that I think is quite depressing is the way that when you see very vigorous activism, the Anna Hazare movement, for all its faults, for example, when you have a real mass of popular support wanting a certain thing to happen, you have the government at the centre just turning a deaf ear and doing absolutely nothing, really making no practical effort to address whatever that complaint is. And I think that one aspect, one offshoot of that, is the utter lack of government action over entirely frivolous, politically motivated cases against artists, writers, and people who say certain things in public. If you look at the case of M.F. Hussain and why he was reluctant to go back, it wasn't that he couldn't technically return, it was the fact that he knew that even though the existing cases were under control, as soon as he landed on Indian soil, a whole host of other frivolous cases would have been filed, saying that he was trying to spread enmity between different communities. So really, until there is specific action from the centre to make it impossible for that to happen, for those kind of cases to be brought, then the present suppression of free speech in the way that it happens is, I think, inevitably going to continue. And so just to close, I thought I'd read from the Delhi High Court's 2008 judgment on the Bharat Mata painting, saying why they shouldn't be going after this distinguished artist. And it's rather beautifully written and quite different from most court judgments. There can be many interpretations to the painting. One of the interpretations to it can be to show that disconsolate India, which is entangled in various problems like corruption, criminalisation, crisis of leadership, unemployment, poverty, overpopulation, low standard of living, fading values and ethics. The other can be that Bharat Mata is perhaps just used as a metaphor for being so bereft because of the earthquake which occurred around the time when the painting was made. Other than this, the bold use of colour and the depiction of the great range of Himalayas by way of the hair flowing of the woman restores the artistic touch in the painting. It seems that the complainants are not the types who would go to art galleries or have an interest in contemporary art. Because if they did, they would know that there are many artists who embrace nudity as part of contemporary art. You know, that is really the crucial point. These are not people who have gone to an art gallery and been offended. These are people who have very carefully manufactured their supposed feeling of being offended. Consensus and accommodation have formed a significant and integral part of Indian culture and the cornerstone of our constitutional democracy. In the context of obscenity, community mores and standards have played a very significant role in the past with Indian courts. Indian art has always celebrated the female form. Beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder, and so does obscenity. Thank you.
But how from colonial times religion gets to be the realm of freedom for Indians. The state is not within the grasp of Indians at the time. The state is an entirely negative force. Religion is the zone of freedom. And it's the zone which allows for mobilization. And yet, of course, and to see religion as a zone of freedom, I think, is an interesting thing to take into account when we look how it has been inherited in independent India. But the point she also makes, which I think is fascinating, is how this zone of freedom does not seem really to be able to produce its own politics. That its freedom is only manifested negatively by injury. So the whole, Savarkar's Six Glorious Epochs, thousands of years of the history of Hinduism, which is all about injury. And there's very little positive thing. There is no positive history of the Hindu in that sense. And I wonder if Shruti is suggesting, or indeed concluding more forcefully, that the problem in fact is that rather than bemoan the politicization of religion, the problem is the opposite, that religion is unable to politicize itself, that it's actually unable to translate itself into a positive political phenomenon, given both its colonial status as the zone of non-political freedom, but also the inability to actually produce a positive politics. I would say that you see the same sort of thing happen in Islamic argument. If you look at the Jamaat-e-Islami from the 1940s onwards, they are really interested in setting limits to the power of the state. Initially the colonial state, then of course the independent state, both in India and Pakistan. The whole point is how do you prevent the state from entering into this zone of non-political religious freedom. How then these religious movements politicize themselves becomes very interesting, because what are they meant to do? It's very contradictory. And could one say of someone like Maududi or indeed Savarkar that there's a kind of version of, since both actually referred in various ways to the communists, of Lenin's principle of the withering of the state. You need to capture the state in order to have it wither away. Your attempt is not to actually constitute the state. And they've been unable to do so, both in India and Pakistan. And maybe the violence comes out of the inability as much as it does out of the attempt to politicize either Hinduism or Islam. For Patrick, I think, again, this really fascinating story about how freedom of expression is both apparently limited severely and yet quite unlimited at the same time. It almost struck me as if, again, since I mentioned communism, unlike the situation, and Tim Gartnash can tell us more about this, in Eastern Europe, or in Russia indeed, it's not necessarily or even preeminently about the state forbidding forbidding various forms of expression that are said to be injurious to it. On the contrary, the state forbids forms of expression that it holds to be injurious not to it as such, that are not taken as being direct attacks on the legitimacy of the state, but in order to preserve communal harmony or to make possible the relationship of different Indians with each other in a peaceable manner. And in that way it might be behaving like the colonial state, that is to say, as a neutral third party, as an arbiter. Shruti disagrees, that whose task is to actually remove itself and to simply negotiate conflicts among Indian citizens, which is very curious, because and when you look at these conflicts as well, they seem for the most part not to be directed at taking power, taking over state power. Even when you had in the last BJP government this attempt to, indeed not an attempt, a definitive rewriting of textbooks, and people were afraid that you're going to have the so-called Safranization of India's entire political and literary culture. It didn't happen. It happens intermittently in the way Patrick you described these things happening. And that just as in Shruti's formulation, it's not like a steady and rising crescendo of threats, but rather these intermittent things which seem to rise up in great waves and then subside. There seems to be no particular trajectory. So they're very destructive and very dangerous and very damaging to individuals and to groups. But it's very difficult to see a kind of steady movement in one direction because they seem to be not really interested in, as it were, ideologically defining the state, which is quite a different thing from saying that a certain politician, a certain party wants power in a particular region. And when they might achieve this power, they would in fact, as you suggested at the end of Hussain, wishing to come back when the BJP was back, they might soft pedal. the very thing that that brought them into power in the first place. So those are my two suggestions. Shall we perhaps take questions and then come back, or would you like to?
Can I have a quick response?
Yes, of course.
Just to clarify, the kind of thing that I was trying to really say was the question of Mother India was at the heart of representation in India. And what has actually happened after 60, 70 years of the third democratic upsurge is a very crass argument to make that you can't represent India. That is really what is at stake. So this is really what I wanted to highlight. It's not simply about capture of state power. It's actually about now the inherent impossibility. And this is where I think the detachment of freedom and India as a singular group is at work. So freedom is already the condition. It's a fulfilled project. It's done, right? And something else has started. And that new historical sequence is of cost. And therefore, that sequence is tied very tightly to the state. So it is not that there is no capturing of the state for a particular ideology. It is that of social justice. And which then, we'll have to, going to read what I'm writing, but this is what in a way produces Ambedkar as a non-violent thinker, because he converts the antagonism of caste into a kind of competition, adversarial politics, and kind of institutionalized antagonism. So I think the state is very fixated on, and this is what my point was, that the fraternal question gets a rage after partition, after, and this is the issue about minority, which that would be an interesting question to ask, because, including the Hussain. So it's not, so in a way, injury is the only option for something like Hindutva to come to even articulate itself. It does not have a history. It will seek this kind of opening through a kind of confrontation of the sort, which is what Savarkar's book is also about. So it's not, I'm not trying to see a liberationist message in it at all for religion. Rather to actually point out the fact that the state, independent and democratic politics in India is fully cast out. Now, you will not, therefore it's, that logic is still not finished. We are in Ambedkar's prison house. And so I think that's something to consider. And therefore I think religion is, it's not, I know that I take what, say, Swapnil Das Gupta says terribly seriously, but, even he went on television to declare on the eve of these coming elections that Hindutva is now not a realistic project. It is a failed project as an ideological project. So even, on the eve of these elections, where they're thinking that Narendra Modi might become, prime minister, there's a detachment from this kind of religious kind. So I think what I was, without theorizing it or articulating it, is that this is actually about democratic India, which is quite different from, it needs these are very constitutive controversies. These are not elitist parlor games. These are they're constitutive of politics.
Well, so just to quickly respond to some of the points you made, I don't think the idea of the state as a neutral arbiter in the way that the colonial state tried to represent itself is really what tends to happen. I think that normally the way that a particular leader or state government will react is purely opportunist. It will be a calculation. It will be an election is coming up on such and such date. Do we give in or not? What is going to be the benefit in terms of votes delivered? And in fact, in the case of Salman Rushdie last year coming to Jaipur, didn't succeed. So I think that quite often that leaders will fan a particular issue rather than trying to, in fact, deal with it. On the question of textbooks, I've written about this in India, a Portrait, and I think that the issue there became totally focused on a handful of cases where effectively right-wing propaganda was dropped into textbooks. But what was not looked at was what was wrong with the textbooks in the first place and why this problem was generated. But I won't go into that again. And I think that the point about not ideologically defining the state is probably true. I think that it's very noticeable the way that national politicians almost avoid those kind of debates. You know, these subjects were debated obsessively all through the 30s and 40s and 50s. And now, when they're even raised with politicians, they shy away from them. They don't want to envisage India. They don't want to say, this is how nationally we might or should progress. Perhaps because the nature of power or the centres of power are altering. And I think that the point Shruti made about social justice in relation to caste in particular is absolutely the case. Another situation that I've published something on the India side is to do with a case which was very, was barely reported at all, which was where a Tamil MP, Tiruma Valavan, and the writer Meenakanda Sami were both taken to court for trying to provoke a riot. That was what they were charged with. And if I remember rightly, what had actually been done in the book, which they published, was that they'd taken two Tamil folk figures called Pona and Sanka, and they had sort of written about them as deities in effect, or they'd sort of increased the reverence with which they should be seen or depicted. And the caste-related case against them was really, in Meenakanda Sami's words, it would be like, I think the example she used was that she said if an African-American writer had said that Jesus Christ was black, and a white person had then gone to court and said, well, she's trying to provoke a riot and cause disharmony between communities by making this assertion. So in other words, what you see there, and eventually that case went in their favour, but what you see there is absolutely about trying to take the state. It's about who has power within the structures of the state, and it's about really a complete reallocation of where the power and responsibility lies, which is something that in the case of Tamil Nadu is obviously going way back over the particular caste politics of the last 100 years. But I think very often in a small way, in those kind of cases, it is exactly about that. It's about who has the right to speak on behalf of people in this particular region.